On July 26, 1981, the government of the United States of America committed an unprecedented act. Congress officially returned the gift. It was not just a souvenir. It was the most luxurious private estate on the continent. 126 rooms, 58 bedrooms, 33 bathrooms finished with gold. The Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida. For 8 years, this house stood empty. It rotted under the humid tropical sun. Federal officials calculated that maintaining this monster cost taxpayers $1 million annually and were horrified. Even the richest country in the world did not have enough money to pay the bills of the dead mistress. This was irony worthy of a Greek tragedy. The woman built this palace as a winter residence for presidents, as a monument to her greatness that was supposed to stand for centuries. But in the end, her dream turned out to be too expensive even for the White House. Welcome to the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post. You know this house. Today, its facade flashes in every news broadcast. You see it against the backdrop of red baseball caps and Donald Trump's political scandals. But long before it became the headquarters of the 45th president, it was the personal cage of the richest woman of her time. A place where the gold on the walls was real and happiness was artificial. When Marjorie died in 1973, her fortune was estimated at $200 million. Adjusted for today's rate, that's $1.5 billion. But numbers lie. They don't show the real scale. For modern billionaires, money is numbers on servers. For Marjorie, money was physical matter. She owned not stocks, but the world. She was the only American woman who could look Joseph Stalin in the eye, sitting at the table in famine-stricken Moscow of 1937, while diamonds that once belonged to the executed Queen Marie Antoinette dangled from her ears. She created the frozen food industry, changing the way all humanity eats. But she herself could not stomach the betrayals of those she loved. 4 husbands. Each subsequent marriage was more luxurious and more catastrophic than the previous one. The first marriage was a youthful mistake. The second made her a social lioness. The third turned her into a diplomatic icon, while her husband openly cheated on her with the wives of his subordinates. The fourth ended in the most humiliating scandal in high society history, when 70-year-old Marjorie received an envelope with photographs by mail. On them, her husband was entertaining himself with young men in that very pool where she hosted charity balls. This is not a story about breakfast flakes, and not about beautiful dresses. This is a court record of how big money corrodes the soul like acid. We will see how the empire was built on the blood and nerves of her father. We will walk the corridors where 3 ships brought stone from Genoa to satisfy one woman's whim. We will peek into the safes where Imperial Fabergé eggs were stored, bought from the Bolsheviks at scrap prices. Marjorie Merriweather Post lived 86 years. She was born in an era when telephones were a rarity, and died when people were already walking on the moon. She tried to buy immortality through her houses, her collections, and her receptions. But in the end, when the coffin was being lowered into the ground, her main creation, Mar-a-Lago, turned out to be unwanted by anyone. The walls soaked in vanity were rejected by the state. How did it happen that the heiress who held the keys to the world ended her life surrounded by servants who were closer to her than her own children? Why was her daughter, the famous actress Dina Merrill, deprived of part of the inheritance? And what is the real price of a ticket to high society if you pay not with dollars, but with human dignity? To understand how this colossus fell, we need to go back. Not to the ballrooms of the 50s, but to the dust and dirt of the late 19th century. To where it smelled not of French perfumes, but of cheap coffee and despair. To where a man named Charles William Post decided that he had no right to be poor, even if it killed him. 1891, the city of Battle Creek, Michigan. If you had been there at that time, you would not have smelled money. You would have smelled iodine, enemas, and boiled cabbage. It was the capital of American hypochondria, a place where the sick, desperate, and dying flocked to get into the famous sanatorium of Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Among these shadows, in a wheelchair, sat a 37-year-old failure. His name was Charles William Post. He was bankrupt. His first business venture, a blanket factory in Illinois, had gone bust. His nervous system was depleted to the diagnosis of neurasthenia, and his stomach refused to accept food. He weighed less than 60 kilograms and looked like a skeleton wrapped in an expensive but already worn suit. Walking beside the wheelchair was his 4-year-old daughter, Marjorie. Her small hands pushed the wheels in which her father sat, a man who believed his life was over. This is a critically important moment. All that insane wealth we will see later, Fabergé eggs, yachts the size of destroyers, balls for 300 guests, all of it was not born from success. It was born from the fear of death and hunger in that very year in Michigan. Charles Post had no money for treatment from Dr. Kellogg. He was housed in the cheap boarding house La Vita Inn, where he lay staring at the ceiling and listening to the rumbling of his sick stomach. But it was this pain that became the catalyst. Post was an inventor by nature, an engineer of chaos. He realized that caffeine was killing his stomach, and if coffee was poison, then the world needed an antidote. In an old barn, having bought a used peanut roaster, a coffee grinder, and a batch of wheat with molasses, he began brewing his black gold. He called it Postum. It was a grain beverage meant to replace coffee. In taste, it resembled burnt bread crust, but Charles Post was not selling taste. He was selling salvation. He became the father of modern marketing. He was the first to understand that people pay not for the product, but for the solution to their problems. He spent his last cents on newspaper ads with frightening headlines. "Coffee is a drug," or "Why is your husband a failure? Maybe it's his breakfast." This was cynicism of the highest order. He frightened the nation to sell it bran. And it worked. In 1895, he was nobody. By 1902, his net profit exceeded $1 million a year. Adjusted for today, that's about $35 million in annual net income. He built a city within a city. The Postum Cereal Company factories operated 24 hours a day. Trains loaded with his boxes fanned out across all of America. Little Marjorie grew up right in the center of this hurricane. She was not a typical heiress hidden behind velvet curtains. Her father took her to board meetings when she was only 10 years old. He led her through the workshops where there was noise and grain dust. He told her, "You must know where every cent comes from." Charles Post wanted a son. He craved an heir who would continue his work, tough and uncompromising. But he had only Marjorie. And so, he decided to reforge her. He hired boxing trainers to teach her to take a punch. He forbade her to cry. He taught her that the only crime in life is to be weak. She adored him. For her, he was not just a father. He was a god who created the universe out of nothing. She glued labels on the first boxes in that very barn and saw how their family moved from a rented room to mansions. But this fairy tale could not have a happy ending. Money cured Charles Post's bank account, but not his demons. By 1914, The empire was at its peak. Post's fortune was estimated at tens of millions. However, the old stomach pain returned. Doctors threw up their hands. Physiologically, he was healthy, but his brain sent signals of agony. He was convinced he was dying. He stopped eating. The man who fed America breakfasts himself died of hunger, sitting at a mahogany table. On May 9, 1914, in his residence in Santa Barbara, California, Charles William Post made the last decision of his life. He was only 59 years old. He could no longer endure the pain. He waited until his wife and doctor left the room. According to the police report, at 1 p.m., a shot rang out. Servants who rushed into the bedroom found him with a still-smoking hunting rifle. He shot himself in the mouth. The great builder, creator of the industry, pioneer of advertising, blew his own head off because he could not buy health for any millions. At that moment, when the echo of the shot faded in the mansion's corridors, the 27-year-old Marjorie Merriweather Post stopped being a daughter. In 1 second, she became the owner of a $20 million fortune. She became the mistress of factories, newspapers, steamships, and the fate of thousands of workers. She stood by her father's coffin, realizing one terrible truth that would define her entire future life. Money does not save. Money did not protect her father from the bullet fired by his own hand. But perhaps, if there is even more money, if we build even bigger houses, if we buy titles and crowns, maybe then the darkness will recede. Marjorie wiped away her tears. Mourning ended. The era of rule began. She inherited not only millions, but also her father's steel will and his manic need for control. The world did not yet know that this young woman with tear-stained eyes would soon turn his modest food company into the global corporation General Foods, and her life into a spectacle whose sets would eclipse the palaces of European monarchs. The Golden Age was beginning, and Marjorie was going to become its empress. But first, she needed to learn to spend in a way that not even her father could have dreamed of. The death of Charles Post became the signal shot. At the moment when his body was cooling, America was entering the craziest era of its history, the Roaring Twenties. It was a time of jazz, short skirts, and easy money. And Marjorie Merriweather Post stood at the crest of this wave, like a figurehead on a ship racing straight toward the rocks. If her father was an ascetic creator, a Spartan who counted every penny and lived for work, then Marjorie became the embodiment of pure, distilled consumption. She did not just spend money. She turned spending money into an Olympic sport in which she had no competitors. She understood one thing inaccessible to nouveau riche. It is not enough to be rich. You need to be untouchable. In 1920, she married for the second time. Her chosen one, Edward Francis Hutton. A handsome man, Wall Street stockbroker, a person with a shark's grip and a Hollywood smile. This was not just a marriage. This was a merger of capitals. They became the first power couple of the 20th century, long before Beyoncé and Jay-Z. Together they did what her father did not have time for. They took his company and began swallowing competitors like a hungry whale swallowing plankton. It was during this period, sitting in smoke-filled Manhattan offices, that Marjorie and Edward created the General Foods Corporation. They bought everything: Jell-O, Baker's chocolate, Maxwell House coffee. But their boldest move came in 1929. Marjorie tries a goose, frozen using a new technology by some naturalist, Clarence Birdseye. Food that lasts for months. It seemed like magic. Marjorie insists on buying the patent. Edward hesitates, but writes a check for $22 million. Adjusted for today, that's almost $340 million. For pea freezing technology. Everyone laughed. But 10 years later, every American home had a refrigerator stocked with their products. While money flowed like a river, Marjorie began building the sets for her life. She felt cramped on the ground. She looked at New York and decided she wanted to live higher than everyone. In 1925, she makes a deal that architects still study to this day. She negotiates the construction of a house on Fifth Avenue, number 1107. But she does not want an apartment. She wants a mansion, lifted into the sky. She demands that the developer create a separate 3-level penthouse for her at the very top. 54 rooms, 17 bathrooms. She had her own grand entrance from the street, her own private lobby, and an elevator that no neighbors were allowed to enter. Imagine this level of isolation. Living in the center of an overcrowded metropolis, she created a system in which she could go years without seeing a single stranger, except for her servants. Her apartment had a fur storage cold room, a wine cellar, and a silver room. When guests came to her, they entered not an apartment, but Versailles, hovering over Central Park. But even the sky was not enough for her. She needed the sea. Together with Hutton, they built the yacht Hussar 5, which later became the legendary Sea Cloud. It was the largest private sailing vessel in the world, 4 masts rising into the sky to 60 meters, hull length 109 meters, crew 72 people. Note, 72 sailors and officers to serve one family. The yacht's interiors shocked even European monarchs. Marjorie personally designed every cabin. Her own on-board bathroom was carved from a single block of Carrara marble, and the faucets were made of gold in the shape of swans. In the sea, where salt water corrodes everything, she demanded golden plumbing. This was a challenge to the elements. She introduced a strict, almost military protocol on board. Sailors had to wear spotless white uniforms, which they changed twice a day. No noise, no kitchen smells. Life on the yacht was supposed to look as if food and drinks materialized from the air at the wave of a magic wand. This was the golden age in all its glossy splendor. It seemed the party would never end. Marjorie and Edward hosted costume balls, where guests dressed in outfits from the era of Louis XVI, unaware of the terrible irony that those French aristocrats ended their lives on the guillotine. But behind the facade of marble and gold, cracks were already beginning to appear that could not be covered even with millions of dollars. Marjorie was obsessed with control. She controlled the menu, the room temperatures, the flower arrangements, and her husband's life. Edward Hutton, a financial genius, began to tire of the role of prince consort to an all-powerful queen. In their perfect penthouse hung a silence broken only by the clink of crystal. Marjorie believed she had built paradise, but in reality, she was erecting a golden cage. She did not yet know that the era of unrestrained revelry was coming to an end. The calendar showed October 1929. The stock market telegraph that stood in her husband's office would soon begin tapping out the funeral march for the American economy. But it did not touch Marjorie Post. She was too rich to notice the Great Depression. While people stood in lines for free soup, she was choosing a new service from Sèvres Porcelain. This was the beginning of her social war, a war in which her main weapons would become concrete, stone, and incredible, overwhelming arrogance. In the world of big money, there exists an invisible but insurmountable wall. On one side of this wall are the old money, descendants of the first settlers, Astors, Vanderbilts, people whose ancestors arrived on the Mayflower. They speak quietly, dress restrainedly, and despise anyone who works for wealth. On the other side, new money. Noisy, flashy, smelling of oil, steel, or, in Marjorie's case, grain. For the high society of New York and Palm Beach, Marjorie Merriweather Post was an upstart. They whispered behind her back. Duchesses and matriarchs of social clans called her the Princess of Dry Breakfasts. There was poison in this nickname. They reminded her, no matter how many diamonds you wear, you are still the daughter of a man who roasted peanuts in a barn. She was not invited to closed dinners. She was ignored at the opera. Any other woman would have broken. Marjorie did otherwise. She decided not to knock on closed doors. She decided to build her own palace, so huge and shining that all other houses next to it would look like servants' quarters. This was a scorched earth tactic, only instead of napalm, she used gold leaf. The battlefield became Palm Beach, Florida. In the 1920s, it was a closed club for the elite. The architectural style here was dictated by Addison Meisner. He built elegant, restrained villas in the Spanish style. But Marjorie did not want restraint. She wanted spectacle. For the construction of her main weapon, the Mar-a-Lago estate, she did not hire just an architect. She hired a theatrical decorator. Joseph Urban was the set designer for the Ziegfeld Follies on Broadway and decorator for the Metropolitan Opera. Imagine this level of cynicism. She was not building a house for living. She was building a stage where she would be the main actress. In 1924, bulldozers entered the jungles of Florida. Construction lasted 4 years. It was madness that cannot be justified by common sense. Marjorie chose a plot between the ocean and the lake, hence the name Mar-a-Lago, from sea to lake. But Florida limestone seemed too plain to her. She ordered 3 ships loaded with Doric stone, straight from Genoa, Italy. When the stone arrived, it turned out there was too much of it. It would have sufficed to build a small European castle. She wanted antique tiles, not just stylization, but real history. Marjorie bought 36,000 antique Spanish tiles from the 15th century. Rumors circulated that her agents literally dismantled roofs and floors in impoverished noble houses in Spain to pack them into crates and ship them to Florida. The interiors of Mar-a-Lago were a slap in the face to the good taste of old money. The living room was an exact copy of the hall in the Chigi Palace in Rome. The ceilings were covered with so much gold that on a sunny day it hurt to be in the room without dark glasses. In the dining room, she installed a Florentine table 9 meters long, inlaid with semi-precious stones. When construction finished in 1927, the budget amounted to $7 million. Adjusted for the 2024 rate, that's $125 million. And that was just the walls. Not counting the furniture, paintings, and tapestries, which cost just as much. Old money was horrified. They called the house vulgar, gaudy, theatrical. But they came. Curiosity defeated snobbery. The opening of Mar-a-Lago became the day of capitulation for the Palm Beach elite. When guests crossed the threshold, they entered a world where reality was cancelled. The walls were hung with 16th century Flemish tapestries that Marjorie had saved from the dampness of European castles. In the main hall hung rock crystal chandeliers, each costing a fortune. Marjorie won this war. She forced them to recognize her not through humility, but through suppression. She introduced her own rules in Mar-a-Lago. The famous quadrilles, balls where millionaires, bankers, and politicians had to dress in cowboy costumes and dance folk dances under her dictation. This was the highest mastery of power. to make the world's most influential people look foolish for your entertainment and make them thank you for it. She proved that in America there is no blue blood that cannot be bought. If you have enough money to bring Genoa to Florida, you are the new aristocracy. However, behind the triumph of the facade hid personal emptiness. Her husband, Edward Hutton, helped build this palace, but he increasingly felt like a guest in it. Mar-a-Lago was created for Marjorie and only for her. It was a temple to her ego. In the huge house with 126 rooms, there was no place for a cozy family dinner.
The irony of fate. This very house, built as a weapon against snobs, decades later would become the symbol of another billionaire outcast, Donald Trump, who would likewise use its golden halls to shock and subdue the establishment. History is cyclical. But before Mar-a-Lago changed owners, Marjorie had yet to make a deal that would elevate her even higher, to the level of international diplomacy and Stalinist terror. Her social ascent was only beginning. Ahead lay divorce, a new marriage, and a ticket to the Soviet Union. By the mid-30s, Marjorie Merriweather Post had learned the main lesson of capitalism. Everything has its price. If love dies, it can be bought out through divorce. If boredom overwhelms, a new life can be purchased. Her second marriage to Edward Hutton, that very union that created the corporate monster General Foods, collapsed. The reason was as old as the world. Edward became too engrossed in consultations with other women. Marjorie threw him out the door, but kept the name, the company, and of course, all her palaces. At 50, most women of that era put on a mob cap and prepared to babysit grandchildren. Marjorie put on diamonds and went hunting. She did not need just a husband. She needed status that could not be bought on the stock exchange. She needed access to history. And she found him, Joseph Edward Davies. This was the deal of the century, framed as a romance. Davies was not an aristocrat. He was a lawyer and politician, a close friend of President Roosevelt. He had ambitions, but no money to fund them. Marjorie had money capable of covering the budget deficit of a small country, but she lacked political weight. This was a classic symbiosis. She gave him a check, he gave her a ticket to the big game. In 1936, President Roosevelt appointed Davies as U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union. For anyone else, it would have been exile. The USSR of 1937 was the epicenter of hell on earth. The Great Terror was underway. Stalinist purges were in full swing. People disappeared at night. Moscow was a gray, hungry, frightened city where even the air was saturated with paranoia. But for Marjorie Post, it became the greatest shopping tour in history. She did not intend to live like the wife of a Soviet ambassador. She intended to live like a czarina arriving for an inspection. Her arrival in Leningrad resembled the invasion of an alien civilization. Her yacht, Sea Cloud, entered the port, a snow-white leviathan against the backdrop of rusty Soviet barges. On the deck stood sailors in dress uniforms, and in the holds lay what Marjorie could not imagine surviving without in the land of the Bolsheviks. Ponder this list. She brought with her 2,000 pints of frozen cream because she feared Soviet bacteria, 25 industrial General Electric refrigerators, tons of prime meat, and, of course, her jewels. She settled in Spaso House, the residence of the American ambassador in Moscow. Seeing the dreary interiors, Marjorie ordered everything redone. She tore off the boring wallpapers from the walls and covered them with bright fabrics. She brought her own chefs. At receptions where Soviet marshals and commissars attended, many of whom would be executed a month later, they served food that had been forgotten in the USSR 20 years earlier. But the most cynical act of this drama played out not at the embassy, but in the commission shops. The Bolsheviks desperately needed currency. To buy machine tools and factories from the West, Stalin ordered the sale of the Romanovs' legacy. Churches were plundered, palaces emptied. Gold, silver, icons, and crowns were carted to Torgsin stores, trade with foreigners. Entrance was closed to Soviet citizens. For Marjorie Post, it was Ali Baba's cave. While the wives of enemies of the people stood in lines for bread, Marjorie walked between counters piled with the treasures of the destroyed empire. She bought everything. She was not buying just things. She was buying someone else's blood and history. It was there that she acquired the item that would become the symbol of her collection, the wedding crown of Empress Alexandra Fyodorovna, that very crown in which Russian tsarinas were crowned. The Bolsheviks sold it as scrap precious metals and stones. Marjorie bought it, fully aware that its last owner had been shot in the basement of the Ipatiev house along with her children. She snapped up imperial porcelain commissioned by Catherine the Great. She redeemed Fabergé Easter eggs that Nicholas II had given to his mother. The price? Laughable. She paid cents for what was worth thousands. This was a looting deal. One empire buying the corpse of another empire at fire sale prices. Marjorie felt no guilt. She felt the thrill of a collector. She called it saving art. In some sense, she was right. If not for her, much of it would have been melted down. But the picture remained surreal. The American queen of dry breakfasts, adorned with Marie Antoinette's diamonds, dines in Moscow, discussing the weather with Molotov and Vyshinsky, the prosecutor who signed death sentences by the thousands. Her husband, Joseph Davies, at that time played the role of a useful idiot. He attended show trials of Trotskyists and wrote reports to Washington justifying Stalin. He said the purges were necessary for the country's security. Marjorie did not care. Politics did not interest her. What interested her was the pink diamond in the display case and how to best organize the next ball. This chapter of her life reveals the true nature of her wealth. It was absolutely hermetic. Reality did not penetrate inside. Famine, executions, terror, all of it happened somewhere out there, beyond the windows of her limousine. Inside, music always played, and chilled champagne was served. By the end of the 30s, when Davies's mission ended, Marjorie had exported so many treasures from the USSR that it took weeks to inventory them. She returned to America not just as a rich woman, she returned as the custodian of Tsarist regalia. She had effectively bought herself the title of successor to the Romanovs, without a drop of blue blood in her veins. But the triumph of diplomacy proved brief. The world was rolling toward World War II, and although Marjorie managed to buy the Empress's crown, she could not buy the love of her ambassador husband. Their marriage, entered into as a business deal, began to crack at the seams. Joseph Davies had gotten from her everything he wanted: fame, money, positions. Now she began to irritate him. An aging, domineering woman who believed the entire world was her personal staff. She built a fortress of things around herself. But things, even if they belonged to czars, are cold to the touch. Her huge houses were growing colder and colder. Soon she would begin building her last, most grandiose monument to loneliness, trying to fill the void with museum exhibits. War loomed, and betrayal loomed, which even she could not foresee. By the mid-50s, Marjorie Merriweather Post finally realized that people disappointed her. Husbands cheat, children grow up and demand independence, friends envy. The only thing that never betrays is things. cold marble, cut diamonds, hand-painted porcelain. They are eternal, they are obedient, and they always shine if polished properly. After the divorce from her third husband, Ambassador Davies, Marjorie decided to build her final bastion. She was almost 70 years old. Most people at this age seek a quiet cottage by the lake. Marjorie bought the Hillwood Estate in Washington, 25 acres of land in the center of the capital. This was no longer just a house. It was a mausoleum in life. Marjorie designed Hillwood from the very beginning not as a residence, but as a future museum. Imagine the psychology of a person who has breakfast knowing that the cup in his hand is a museum exhibit. Who walks on carpets knowing that in 20 years, tourists with audio guides will walk here. She lived inside a display case. The architecture of Hillwood was the architecture of total control. Marjorie turned everyday life into a military operation. Her morning began not with coffee, but with reports. The estate's staff consisted of more than 30 people: butlers, footmen, maids, cooks, gardeners, and even a special person responsible for the preservation of the silver. It was a small, sovereign state within the United States of America. Here reigned the Post Protocol. It was stricter than at the court of the English Queen. Every action was regulated. Flowers in vases had to be changed daily, and they could only be cut at a specific time of day so that the buds were in perfect tone. If a footman placed a plate a centimeter further from the edge of the table than prescribed by the instructions, it was considered sabotage. Marjorie kept special ledgers, dinner books. In them was recorded every dish served to every guest over the last 10 years. If Senator Kennedy ate chicken at her place in 1955, then in 1956, he absolutely could not be served chicken again. Repetition meant admitting defeat of imagination. This was a phenomenal, manic work of memory and bureaucracy for one dinner. Security occupied a special place in this architecture. After returning from the USSR and the start of the Cold War, Marjorie became obsessed with the idea of survival. But she planned to survive in comfort. Several bunkers were built in Hillwood, one for her and selected staff, another for jewelry. Special climate-controlled vaults protected her collection. If Washington were covered by a nuclear mushroom, Marjorie planned to outlast the end of the world, admiring Fabergé eggs. This was the pinnacle of absurdity. Preparing for the apocalypse by saving not people, but diamond diadems. But the most terrible thing in this house was the silence. In the huge dining room, paneled with 18th century French panels, Marjorie often dined alone, or in the company of a companion whose job was to entertain the hostess with conversation. But Marjorie hated boredom. She could not tolerate when conversation dead-ended or became uninteresting. Under the dining table, right under the carpet where her feet in satin shoes stood, was built in a secret button, an electric bell. If a guest started speaking too long, or if the topic displeased her, or if she simply got tired, she pressed the button with her foot. For guests, nothing happened. The bell was not heard. But in the kitchen, a light came on. Within a second, doors flew open, and the butler entered with a tray or message, interrupting the conversation. "Madam, you're wanted on the phone," or "Madam, it's time for dessert." This was an ejection button from reality. She could turn off any person like she turned off the radio. This detail speaks of her loneliness more than any memoirs. A person who needs a mechanical way to interrupt communication because they have forgotten how to speak sincerely. Power is the ability not to listen to what does not interest you. Servants in Hillwood were shadows. They wore special soft-soled shoes so as not to clatter on the parquet.
They knew secret passages in the walls to appear and disappear unnoticed. Marjorie required her bed linens to be ironed every day, even if she did not sleep in them. Roses in the garden had to be a specific shade of pink, post pink. If a bud of a different shade opened, the gardener had to cut it immediately. Nature, too, had to obey the corporate charter. But in the evenings, when receptions ended, when the last limousines drove out the wrought iron gates, the house turned into a cold crypt. Marjorie was left alone with her treasures. She walked the corridors hung with portraits of dead tsars and empresses. She looked at the wedding crown of Alexandra Fyodorovna and perhaps saw her reflection in it. Two women who had everything and who lost the main thing. One lost life in a basement, the other lost life in a golden cage. In 1958, she married for the fourth time to Herbert May, a wealthy businessman, hunting enthusiast. It seemed that this time everything would be calm. Herbert was cheerful, compliant, and looked excellent in a tailcoat next to her at receptions. He moved into Hillwood and became part of the interior. But Marjorie did not know that the architecture of her power had a blind spot. She controlled the menu, flowers, and air temperature, but she could not control what happens when she falls asleep. Herbert May, the ideal fourth husband, began leading a double life right under the nose of his all-powerful wife. And this secret would destroy the last illusion of family happiness that Marjorie had so diligently built. The walls of Hillwood, meant to protect her from the outside world, would prove useless against the betrayal that already lived inside. Rot had already penetrated the foundation. Soon, thunder would strike, and it would come in the form of an ordinary mail envelope. The early 1960s. America was entering the era of color television, the moon landing, and the sexual revolution. But in Marjorie Merriweather Post's estates, time had stopped somewhere in 1910. She continued to live by rules written by dead people for a non-existent world. She demanded that men wear tuxedos to dinner, even when the rest of the world was changing into jeans. Outwardly, everything looked impeccable. Marjorie and her fourth husband, Herbert May, seemed like the ideal couple on magazine covers. They smiled, holding hands on the terrace of Mar-a-Lago. Herbert, stately, gray-haired, always gallant, seemed like the very quiet harbor she had sought for half a century. But behind these smiles hid rot that ate away at the empire's foundation faster than termites eat wood. The first crack did not come from her husband, but from flesh and blood, from her younger daughter, Nadenia Hutton. Nadenia was the only one who inherited Marjorie's beauty and her grandfather Charles's stubbornness. But she did not want to be a social lioness. She did not want to spend her life choosing guest seating. She wanted to be an actress. In Marjorie Post's world, this was tantamount to wanting to become a streetwalker. In the 19th century, whose mentality Marjorie lived by, actresses entered the house through the back door. The conflict was brutal. Marjorie used her main weapon, money. She threatened to disinherit her daughter. She shouted that the Post name would not appear in the credits of cheap films. Nadenia struck back. She changed her last name. She became Dina Merrill. She gave up the silver spoon for the right to work. Imagine this scene. The mother, owner of a $500 million fortune, sits in her private cinema at Mar-a-Lago and watches the film Butterfield 8. On the screen, her daughter plays the role of a mistress, a woman of dubious morality, alongside Elizabeth Taylor. For Marjorie, this was public humiliation. It seemed to her that her daughter was selling the family honor for a fee that Marjorie spent on one lunch. Relations were frozen. The rot of alienation had penetrated the heart of the family.
But the real blow, the blow from which Marjorie would never psychologically recover, did not come from Hollywood. It came by mail. 1964. Marjorie is 77 years old. She is having breakfast at Hillwood. The butler brings the mail on a silver tray. Among the bills and invitations lies a thick envelope without a return address. She opens it with a paper knife with a jade handle. Inside are photographs. On glossy paper is captured her husband, Herbert May, her quiet harbor. But he is not at a social reception. He is in the pool of their house, and he is completely naked. Splashing in the water beside him are young, athletic youths. The scenes in the photographs left no room for imagination. It was an orgy. In 1964, this was not just infidelity. It was a criminal offense. Homosexuality was considered a pathology, a perversion, grounds for a prison term, and absolute social destruction. Marjorie looked at the photos. The man who slept in the next bedroom, who wore her ring, who commanded her servants, had used her favorite house, her sanctuary, Mar-a-Lago, as a brothel for his pleasures. Moreover, these photos had been sent for the purpose of blackmail. Someone wanted money for silence. At that moment, it was not just the family that collapsed. Marjorie's faith in her ability to control her life collapsed. She had bought security, built bunkers, hired guards, but the enemy had already lived inside the fortress for 6 years. She realized that all those years she had been for Herbert just a convenient cover, a rich old woman whose millions provided him with a beautiful life and cover for his secret vices. Marjorie's reaction was instantaneous and merciless. No tears, no hysterics. In her awakened the very Commodore, her father. She called the lawyers. Herbert May was thrown out of the house faster than the staff changed ashtrays. His things were packed and sent to storage. His name was struck from the guest lists. Marjorie forbade mentioning him in her presence. The divorce was processed at cosmic speed. She paid off the blackmailers, but not for Herbert's sake, but so that these photos would never reach the newspapers. She bought silence. But the silence in the empty house became deafening. After expelling Herbert, Marjorie was left alone in her 126 rooms. She was almost 80. 4 husbands, 4 failures. The world whispered. People gloated. "Look at her," they said. "She has the Empress's crown, but no one to bring her a glass of water with love, rather than for a salary." It was then that her health began to fail. Rot reached the body. She began having problems with her hearing. The great hostess who conversed with kings now often smiled inappropriately because she simply could not hear the question. But she refused to wear a hearing aid in public. It was a sign of weakness. Hand tremors began. A slight shaking that she tried to hide by gripping her champagne glass tighter. Sometimes the clink of crystal against teeth gave her away. She feared becoming frail more than death. She increased the staff of servants. Now they literally carried her in their arms. If she wanted to go up to the second floor but the elevator was far, sturdy footmen picked her up in a special chair. The illusion of grandeur was maintained, but behind the scenes there was already the smell of medicines and old dust. Mar-a-Lago and Hillwood turned into golden cages where the aging lioness was living out her days, surrounded by things that could not hug her. She won the war for wealth, but lost the war for happiness. However, fate had one more trial in store for her. The final act of the tragedy. The point of no return, when she would realize that even her main legacy, her houses, was unwanted by anyone. The end of an era was approaching,
and it would be as cruel as her entire life. The late 60s and early 70s became a time of bitter realization for Marjorie Merriweather Post. She faced an enemy that could not be bribed, intimidated, or challenged to a duel. This enemy was not old age or even death. This enemy was irrelevance.
All her life, she built monuments to herself. Mar-a-Lago in Florida, Hillwood in Washington, Camp Topridge in the Adirondack Mountains. These were not just houses. They were sovereign states with their own laws and armies of servants. She believed that after her death, her children would gratefully accept these keys and continue the tradition. But one day, at a family dinner, she saw fear in the eyes of her daughters. When she spoke about the inheritance, her daughters, Adelaide, Eleanor, and Dina, exchanged glances. They did not want these palaces. For them, Mar-a-Lago was not paradise, but a financial guillotine. Maintaining the Florida estate required about $1 million a year at the rate of that time. In today's money, that's almost $8 million annually just for mowing lawns, cleaning the pool, and security, even if no one lives there. This was the mathematics of the curse. Marjorie realized she had created monsters that no one except her could feed. Her real estate empire was doomed to division and auction sale. For a woman who spent half a century creating her world, the thought that strangers would sleep in her bedrooms and eat from her plates was unbearable. And then she came up with her last, most desperate plan. If the children cannot take these houses, the state must take them. She decided to gift Mar-a-Lago to the US government. In her imagination, it looked perfect. President Richard Nixon would receive world leaders in her living room, under her chandeliers, sitting in her chairs. This would immortalize the Post name forever. She would become the mother of the nation, the hostess of the Winter White House. She began lobbying Congress with the same ferocity with which her father once sold coffee substitutes. She arranged lunches for senators. She pulled the levers of influence. And in October 1972, she won. President Nixon signed the law accepting Mar-a-Lago as a gift from Mrs. Post. This was her last triumph. She sat in a wheelchair, deaf, weak, but with a victorious smile. She thought she had outsmarted time. She did not know that it was a Pyrrhic victory. The government took the house without enthusiasm, more out of politeness to the great old lady and her money. Officials were already whispering that this gift would become a budget black hole. Meanwhile, her body, this biological spacesuit that she had cherished and pampered for 80 years, began to fail. The irony of fate was cruel. The daughter of the king of dry breakfasts, the woman who fed the world with frozen products, began to die from digestive problems. Her stomach, like her father's, became the center of pain. The last months of 1973 passed in the silence of Hillwood. Marjorie hardly got up. But the Post protocol operated until the last breath. Even when she could not eat, the table was set in full splendor. Fresh orchids were delivered to her room every morning. Servants, many of whom had worked for her for 30 years, ironed her nightgowns as if preparing her for a ball. On September 12, 1973, Marjorie Merriweather Post's heart stopped. She was 86 years old. She died in her bed, looking at the things she loved more than people. The news of her death spread like lightning. Newspapers came out with headlines, "End of an era." And it was not an exaggeration. Together with her died the lifestyle that began with gas lamps and ended in the era of atomic energy. The funeral was modest by her standards, but symbolic.
Her ashes were buried in the garden of Hillwood, at the base of a granite stele. She remained in her museum forever, becoming its main exhibit. But the real tragedy unfolded immediately after the farewell speeches fell silent. As soon as the body was carried out, the lawyers opened the will, and reality crashed down on the heirs like a cold shower. Marjorie left generous funds. She took care of the servants.
But she left behind infrastructure designed for an empress's life. The US government, which received the keys to Mar-a-Lago, conducted the first inspection. Federal agents walked through the gold-paneled halls and shook their heads. Guarding the president in a house with 126 rooms and dozens of entrances was a nightmare for the Secret Service. Heating and cooling this palace cost more than maintaining the real White House. The gift turned out to be a Trojan horse. In Washington, officials began looking for a way to return the gift. At Hillwood, which was supposed to become a museum, curators clutched their heads, trying to figure out how to preserve thousands of fragile Russian art items. And Marjorie's daughters, freed from their mother's tyranny, sighed with relief and horror at the same time. The point of no return had been passed. Marjorie's personality, which by force of will held this universe in order, disappeared. Gravity disappeared. And the magnificent debris of her empire began a slow, agonizing fall. Instead of becoming the Winter White House, Mar-a-Lago would end up abandoned. For 8 years, it would stand empty, overgrown with mold, while the government litigated to get rid of it. Birds would begin nesting on the balconies where dukes once danced. The gold would start to dull. Marjorie's great dream of immortality through real estate collided with bureaucracy and economics. She died confident that her name would live forever in government acts. But the world was preparing to strike her out, sell off her collections, and forget, like a nightmare, the mad spending of the Gilded Age. Ahead was collapse. The Great Fall, on the ruins of which a new predator would appear. Imagine a picture worthy of Stephen King's pen. 1980. The huge wrought iron gates of Mar-a-Lago locked with rusty chains. On the driveway, where Rolls-Royces of ambassadors and kings once parked, weeds are breaking through. Inside, in the halls where the walls are covered with gold leaf, there stands a dead, humid silence. Air conditioners are turned off to save money. Florida's tropical heat slowly but surely begins to devour the masterpieces. Mold creeps over the 16th century Flemish tapestries. The parquet floor, on which the heels of the world's richest women clicked, begins to warp from dampness. Marjorie Merriweather Post's great dream of the Winter White House turned into America's most expensive haunted house. The government of the United States of America, which received this palace as a gift, behaved like an ungrateful relative. Neither President Nixon, nor Ford, nor Carter ever stayed here overnight. For the Secret Service, this house was a nightmare. Too many windows, too many open spaces. It could be shot at from the sea and from the air. Moreover, the annual maintenance cost the budget $1 million. Adjusted for the 2025 rate, that's almost $4 million of taxpayers' money thrown away on trimming bushes and polishing marble in an empty house. In 1981, the U.S. Congress committed a humiliating act. They voted to return the gift. The government officially stated, "We don't need it. Take it back." The keys to the 126 rooms were thrown back into the hands of Marjorie's daughters. For the heiresses, Dina Merrill and her sisters, this was a catastrophe. They received back not an asset, but a liability of monstrous proportions. They were rich, yes, but even their trust funds could not indefinitely cover the costs of maintaining this leviathan.
They paid property taxes, insurance, and security salaries while the house stood empty and rotted. The only possible decision was made: sell. Mar-a-Lago was put on the market for $20 million. It seemed like a fair price for a palace that was built for $7 million in the 20s, but the real estate market was silent. No one wanted to buy this monument to vanity. The old money of Palm Beach looked at the mansion with contempt. For them, it was too vulgar, too huge, too expensive to maintain. The new money preferred building modern villas with panoramic windows and smart electronics, rather than living in a museum where you couldn't hang a plasma on the wall without damaging a 15th century fresco. The house hung on the market for a year, 2, 3. The price was lowered, but there were no buyers. The city authorities of Palm Beach were already rubbing their hands, hoping that the heirs would give up, demolish the palace, and sell the land for elite cottage development. This would have been the end of the story. Bulldozers would have torn down the tower from which Marjorie looked at the ocean, and the history would have been erased. And then the predator stepped onto the stage. His name was Donald Trump. He was 39 years old.
He was the embodiment of everything the old aristocracy hated, and everything Marjorie secretly admired: audacity, drive, and absolute confidence in his right to own the world. Trump flew to Palm Beach not for history. He flew for a trophy. He inspected the house and immediately understood its potential. Not as private housing — living there alone would have been madness — but as a private club. He offered the heiresses $15 million. The Post family, offended by such a low price for their mother's life's work, refused. They considered it robbery. They hoped for a better buyer. This was their fatal mistake. They did not know who they were dealing with. Trump did not retreat. He played a gambit that would enter textbooks on hard negotiations. Through straw buyers, he purchased a tiny plot of land right in front of Mar-a-Lago, a strip of beach between the ocean and the mansion. Having paid just $2 million for it, he publicly stated that he would build an ugly concrete box there. A huge blank wall that would completely block the ocean view from the windows of Mar-a-Lago. This was checkmate. Without the ocean view, the palace's value dropped to zero. Who would buy a Florida mansion with a view of a concrete wall? The heirs were cornered. Maintaining the house was burning through their money. There were no buyers, and now this brazen New York developer threatened to turn their elite property into illiquid. In 1985, the deal happened, and it was not a sale. It was a capitulation. Donald Trump bought Mar-a-Lago, the entire palace, the entire territory, and, most incredibly, all the contents. He paid just $5 million for the house, and another $3 million he paid for the furniture and antiques. Ponder these numbers: $8 million for everything. Less than Marjorie spent on construction in the 20s without accounting for inflation. If recalculated to real value, Trump bought the house for 3% of its replacement cost. He got the collection that Marjorie had gathered for half a century: Florentine mosaic tables, carpets, chandeliers, silver, practically for free, as a bonus to the walls. This was the end of the Post era. What was created as a sacred place, as a temple of the dynasty, went under the hammer at the price of a used car on the scale of the elite real estate market. But the sale did not end there. Trump, becoming the owner, began reshaping history to suit himself. He needed money for renovation, and without sentiment, he began getting rid of what he did not like. Part of the furniture was sold at auctions. Portraits of the Post family were removed from the walls. In their place appeared portraits of the new owner. Marjorie Merriweather Post's coat of arms which adorned fireplaces and dishes, was replaced. Trump invented his own coat of arms, suspiciously similar to an old British heraldic emblem, and placed it everywhere where the post monogram had been before. He erased the memory of the mistress, leaving only her decorations. The Post family watched this in horror, but they could do nothing. They had sold their past. Dina Merrill, Marjorie's daughter, publicly stated that her mother would have turned in her grave if she knew what her house had become. But history knows no subjunctive mood. At the same time, another part of the legacy, the Hillwood estate in Washington, avoided this fate. Marjorie, taught by bitter experience, left Hillwood a huge monetary fund that allowed it to exist autonomously as a museum. There, among the display cases, everything remained untouched. The wedding crown, Fabergé eggs, Catherine the Great's services, they froze in time, guarded by curators. But the living heart of the empire, her beloved Mar-a-Lago, was torn from the family's chest. It ceased to be the home of an aristocrat and became a billionaire's business project. The Great Fall was complete. Old money lost. New money, aggressive and unscrupulous, entered the grand doors without wiping their feet. Marjorie was gone. Her servants were fired or rehired by the new owner. Her rules were forgotten. The button under the table to summon footmen stopped working. But the echo of her ambitions remained. The irony of fate was that this very vulgar Trump would ultimately fulfill her dream, albeit in a perverted form. He would indeed make this house the Winter White House, hosting presidents and world leaders there. But that would be a completely different story, and a completely different America. Today, the name Marjorie Merriweather Post is almost forgotten by the general public. If you stop a passerby on Times Square and ask who she is, most likely you will not get an answer. But the paradox is that we live in a world that she helped create, and every day we look at the walls that she erected. Her main creation, Mar-a-Lago, became the most famous private house on the planet. But not as a monument to a taste, but as a symbol of a new, aggressive era. Marjorie's dream came true in the most perverted way. She wanted her house to become the Winter White House. And it did. Presidents really make decisions there that affect the fates of the world. Decrees are signed there, and summits are held. But if Marjorie's ghost walked through these halls today, it would be horrified. Instead of quiet conversations to the sound of a harp, political rallies roar there. Instead of refined quadrilles, where everyone is dressed in historical costumes, people in red baseball caps walk there. Donald Trump, who bought her dream at fire sale prices, erased her personality, but used her decorations to build his own myth. This is the greatest irony of fate. An aristocratic, snobbish house, built to exclude commoners, became the headquarters of populism. And what happened to her other pride? The yacht Sea Cloud? That very four-masted giant, where the crew changed uniforms twice a day, and the faucets were made of gold. It did not rot or get scrapped for metal. It is alive. Today, it is an elite cruise liner. Any of you who has an extra $5,000 can buy a ticket and spend a week in the cabin where Marjorie slept. What was the Holy of Holies, accessible only to kings and diplomats, is now sold in tourist brochures. Dentists from Arizona and accountants from London sleep in her bed and take selfies in her marble bathroom. This is the democratization of luxury that she feared so much. Exclusivity died. Only the price tag remained. But there is one place where the spirit of Marjorie Merriweather Post still holds the line. It is the Hillwood Estate in Washington. There, among 25 acres of gardens, time froze in 1973. According to her will,
not a single item was moved even an inch. In the display cases, the diamond crown of the Empress and Fabergé Easter eggs still shine. Daily, hundreds of tourists put on shoe covers and walk on her parquet. They look at her portraits, her dresses, her porcelain. However, this is dead beauty. Hillwood is not a house. It is a mausoleum of thingism. Visitors admire the wealth, but they do not feel warmth. They see the cold gleam of gold that outlived its mistress. It is a monument to loneliness. All these thousands of items, saved from the fire of the Russian Revolution and shipped across the ocean, are now just inventory numbers in a museum catalog. And what about the people? What happened to the dynasty? The General Foods Company, the empire built on the blood and nerves of her father Charles, has long dissolved in global mergers and acquisitions. Today, the brands created by the Post family belong to faceless transnational corporations. The surname Post remains only in small print on boxes of cereal that millions of people buy, without even suspecting that behind this name lies the tragedy of one family. Her daughter, Dina Merrill, died in 2017. She was the last thread connecting that era to the present. Dina became a successful actress and philanthropist, proving to her mother that a woman can not only spend, but also work. But with her passing, the living memory of the Gilded Age finally faded. Marjorie's grandchildren and great-grandchildren live a quiet life of wealthy people. They sold the remnants of real estate, divided the trust funds, and dissolved into the crowd. None of them tried to repeat the scale of their grandmother. They learned the lesson. Being an emperor in a democratic country is too heavy a cross. The story of Marjorie Merriweather Post is the story of the price we pay for trying to buy immortality. She was born in a world where her father pushed a cart with grain into an old barn, dreaming simply not to die of hunger. She died in a world where her name was a synonym for unimaginable luxury. She walked the path from the daughter of a sick inventor to a woman who dined with Stalin and built palaces. But what remained in the dry residue? The golden servant call button under the table, which no longer works. The crown of the murdered empress in bulletproof glass. And the huge house in Florida, which now bears another person's name. In the finale, we return to the beginning. To that little girl in Michigan who looked at her father and believed that if you earn enough money, the pain will go away. Marjorie's life proved the opposite. Money can buy marble from Genoa, carpets of Louis XVI, and even a piece of another country's history. But it cannot buy immunity from betrayal, insurance against oblivion, and a guarantee that your children will be happy in the golden cages you built for them.